So I'm just taking a look around. My eyes aren't as good as it used to be years ago. Hello. To say good morning to everybody and welcome you back live to Sunday Symposium. We're very excited to have you here. Okay, and may I ask you? Can I ask you please to put your phones on mute? Thank you very much. We have any Oakmont announcements? We sure do. Here you go.
Hi, everybody. I'd like to give a shout out to the Linda Gentile concert that's going to happen here at the Burger next Saturday night at 7 o'clock. She's coming all the way from the East Coast. And the reason we got her was because Gordon Friedman and Karen Palmiotti really recommended her. Karen says she's fabulous. She has a repertoire of about 2,000 songs. She's a pianist and entertainer. And she'll be playing popular American composers like Benny Goodman and Cole Porter and Irving Berlin, and so forth. So it's at 7 o'clock. We would encourage people to register ahead of time, either through the Lifelong Learning website or at the office in the OVA office folder. But there's also, will be at the door. We will require proof of vaccination. So anyway, hope to see most of you there. Thank you.
Are there any other announcements? Well, I have more things for you. We want to thank you for your donations and your support while we were Zoom only. Thank you for supporting us through the Oakmont Community Foundation. It has really helped us through this season. So thanks again for your support. I'd also like to give a big shout out to our IT department that has kept the symposium going through the pandemic. I want to thank all of them. Jeff, you've been instrumental. Judy, George, Lynn, everybody who's been helping get this on the air and doing this hybrid meeting. It's just been superb. And I know it's taken a lot of time. So thank you very much. Next week's speaker, March 6th, Kevin Berbinsky, Confessions of a Bookmaker, 50 Years of Photographer. You know, that's just going to be incredible. So please do come. And then on March 13th, mark your calendars, we have Diana McDonald, who is our new city council member for District 2, which is our district, yay. And she will be coming to greet us. And little heads up, that's daylight savings time. So you're going to have to get up a little earlier to get here to symposium, but that will be a really good one to attend also. Gabriel Campbell is one of our members of our speaker committee, and he gets these fantastic speakers for us. And we would like to welcome him up here to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Virginia. It's a great pleasure and honor to introduce Deidre English to give a talk on what's happened to our news. I can't imagine anyone more qualified. She worked for 8 years as editor-in-chief of the Mother Jones magazine, which, as many of you know, is a highly acclaimed national liberal magazine of investigative reporting and opinion. She has written and edited works on a wide array of subjects related to investigative reporting, cultural politics, gender studies, and public policy, including for The Nation and the New York Times Book Review. English has also hosted news and current affairs programs on public radio and television. She has founded women's studies programs and taught American studies and journalism at SUNY, the City College of New York, and the University of California at Santa Cruz and Berkeley. And now she's been at Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism since 1997, where she also served as the director of the renowned Felker Magazine Center. Deirdre English's books include Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, A History of Women Healers, Complaints and Disorders, The Sexual Politics of Sickness, and For Her Own Good, 2 centuries of the expert's advice to women. Deidre has won numerous awards for her magazines, her feature writing, and for her professional excellence from her peers. Deidre, we are honored to welcome you to the symposium. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate being asked to speak with you and to hopefully get you to join me in my obsession with the problems of what is happening to the news. And at the end, I hope we'll have a good conversation and be focusing on what to do about it. So let me tell you a little bit more about myself than has already been conveyed in that introduction. My father was a foreign correspondent. He was a newspaper man, and he worked for the Chicago Tribune, covering the Spanish Civil War and the early part of World War II in France, and later in Italy, where he worked for Radio Free America. And I was really arrested by an article that Judy just sent me that I hadn't read before by McKay Coppins in The Atlantic, which details the downfall of the Chicago Tribune, the paper that my father worked for, which has been taken over by vulture hedge fund Alden Capital, which is squeezing it dry and destroying it, as it is doing to so many newspapers around the country. So my father, after his newspaper days, decided to found a magazine. He founded a magazine that was called Chicago Magazine, and there's a Chicago Magazine today, but it's not the same. It was one of the first of the city magazines, and he modeled it on the New Yorker, but he included photography and art when the New Yorker still didn't. And he wanted to help elevate the city of Chicago in its own eyes. But I had an early introduction to the problems of journalism publications because there wasn't enough support for Chicago Magazine, and after 8 years, it went bankrupt. And later, my father went on to become an editor and publisher of scholarly books, but he always mourned the death of his magazine. So despite the model of my father as being so motivated as a journalist, I don't think I would have entered journalism if it had not been for the war in Vietnam and then the uprising of the women's movement. These two very formative movements that I was part of, I was an anti-war activist and certainly part of the early women's movement, taught me the failures of the mainstream media. The Vietnam War was perpetuated largely by government misinformation, something that was revealed finally with the publication of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, when the New York Times and the Washington Post revenged a little bit on the misinformation that government handlers had been giving them all along by publishing the account that had been pulled together by Robert McNamara, and then, as you know, was released by Dan Ellsberg, to show that the government had been knowingly lying all along to the president, to Congress, and to the American media. And yet I was very well aware as an anti-war activist that there were alternative sources of information coming from journalists outside of the mainstream media that were telling the story of what was really going on in Vietnam. And so seeing the enormous failure of the mainstream media in that way had an enormous effect on me. The second one was my participation in the women's movement, which also, led to a distrust of established authority. The women's movement in its early days was often treated with mockery and disdain in the mainstream media, which was essentially run mainly by white men. So these, I think, were motivating insights that made me feel that it was important to have alternative voices. It was important to have independent sources of information. I arrived at Mother Jones magazine 2 years after its founding by an all-male band of political journalists. and a time when I'd already been writing and publishing about women's rights. The magazine was ripe for a bit of a gender shakeup, and I did all I could as editor-in-chief to bring in more women reporters, editors, and writers. At that time, you will remember, the magazine world was very gender segregated. There were women's magazines and men's magazines. There were women's pages at newspapers, which mainly dwelt on fashion and cooking. And the journals of public opinion and political magazines had almost no female bylines and usually had mostly male readers as well. But as women were becoming more educated and entering the professions, they were eager to participate in these meaningful debates. So today I teach at the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley, and by far the majority of our applicants are women, and more than half of the student body is women. There's been a big change. And every year I'm excited to see us welcome a batch of about 50 to 60 young people who are, as I think of it, showing up for duty. They're fervent believers in reporting the news, and they are much more advanced than ever before as they master skills that we teach them about how to ferret out information, filing Freedom of Information Act inquiries, learning data-driven reporting, multimedia design, video and audio storytelling. And these days at the journalism school, we have a renewed focus on diversity in terms of race and ethnicity too. Understanding, certainly in the wake of Black Lives Matter movement, the importance of bringing more diversity into newsrooms so that the media don't miss major stories, for example, that have to do with police brutality and other forms of racism. So this is all good, but the problem is that we are now living in an era of the breakdown of fact-based, truth-seeking journalism, which thrives in democracies and supports their health. And we're in the era of the rise of fake news, misinformation and disinformation, which thrives in autocracies and enables them. Fake news can be simply defined, or misinformation and disinformation, I think, can be defined as inaccurate or untrue information passed off as true. The problem is it creates a low quality information environment where content is wielded not with the intent to inform, but to deceive or to manipulate for some kind of gain, financial, political, or power. People who are misled or confused by conflicting information can't make good decisions. And that low quality information environment is one reason why we are now being termed an anocracy by some scholars, combining elements of democracy and autocracy. Yes, we are in danger of losing the pillars of democracy. We're seeing increasing news deserts in this country, places that have no local paper, often because of the actions of the Alden Capital and other large corporate entities that have been snuffing out the life of local papers. Poynter Institute, which is a journalism site, says that in the past 15 years, more than a quarter of American newspapers have gone out of business. And there are at least 1,800 communities that had a local news outlet in 2004 that do not have one anymore. Journalism is not a numerically large profession to begin with. And there's been this huge decline in journalism jobs. Many newspapers had to cut back on essentials as well as laying people off. They cut overseas bureaus and reporters. They downgraded their investigative units. Papers got thinner, and when you read them online, you see they're often cluttered with advertorials. Those are advertisements that are laid out to look like editorials or like features, and with pop-up ads. And increasingly, these take the form of those loud videos that you cannot skip. Journalism is not a well-paid profession. The Pew Research Center tells us that journalists make less money than other college-educated workers. The median earnings of newsroom employees with a college degree are about $51,000 compared with roughly 59,000 for all other college-educated workers. Compare that with about 63,000 for those who majored in business and about 68,000 for those with undergraduate degrees in science, engineering, and related fields. Well, it could be worse. Employees with bachelor's degrees in education make even less, with median earnings of about 47,000. And a well-educated population and a free press are the essentials for us to thrive as a democracy. But we see these as the least honored, as measured by income, of professions. Journalism careers are rife with turnover. I see this as our students graduate. I've been teaching there now for 20 years, more than 20 years, and I can watch their careers over time, 5 years out, 10 years out, 15 years out from graduation. And I see that even our star students are constantly having to change jobs as they work for one media outlet that closes and have to move to another. For those of you who have hoped, as I did, that digital publications would supplant the old newsprint publications as they died, the news is not good. Every year, about as many of these new digital outlets die as new ones bloom. And not only that, but if we pull back and look at the situation of journalists globally, not just in this country, it's an increasingly dangerous profession. Last year, from 2021 to 2022, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 293 journalists were imprisoned, setting a new record, higher than the 280 that were imprisoned the year before. Around the world, repressive regimes have been cracking down on the independent press. Last year, 40 journalists were killed or died in ways that are under investigation due to the suspicious circumstances of their demise. And 66 journalists are missing. So, why is this a bad thing? I think that we all know that this is a moment when there's a tremendous need for global cooperation because of the threat of global warming. As this climate change crisis accelerates, the world needs to cooperate across borders, and that requires trusting in scientifically sound information and supporting leaders who can do the same. But instead, around the world, we are more divided and polarized than ever before, so that our precious time is wasted arguing pointlessly with each other across our filter bubbles and echo chambers. All of us should be taking action to combat climate change, and so we should all be playing a role in fostering good information environments as well. And I hope we'll focus at the end of today's discussion on ways to do that. So the crisis of low quality information, misinformation and disinformation is brought into focus for us today by two major stories. The first, of course, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Here we see Putin, the dictator, using the big lie that Ukraine is run by Nazis and drug addicts. And an NPR report yesterday said that Russian officials have been making ludicrous claims designed to set up a narrative to justify the invasion to the Russian people. These are stories about Ukrainians committing genocide, burying civilians in mass graves, setting off explosives, and most recently, accusing Ukraine of wanting nuclear weapons. Over recent days, we've also seen leaders of the so-called separatist regions in Ukraine, the ones that Putin has recognized just recently, as well as Russian officials, posting videos on social media in which they try to make it look like they are under threat by Ukrainians in real time. But internet sleuths have been digging through metadata in those files and other clues, like images on the officials' watches, and proving that actually They were not posted in real time at all. They were posted hours after they were first filmed. And so these videos were clearly staged propaganda. And by the way, these types of internet fact checking are among the skills that we train students in at the J School. The techniques of fact checking are being extraordinarily upgraded in our new tech-centered world. No surprise, Russia has clamped down on the non-state-run media in Russia. Yesterday, 3 journalists from Radio Free Europe, which my father used to work for, were arrested because they were covering a demonstration in Moscow, I think it was. And Russian states media is running anti-Biden rants from Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity on RT, Russian TV. So we begin to see the connection between misinformation on Fox News and its amplification in Russia as well. We're seeing a shooting war and a war of information. Add to the fog of war, the fog of information battles. So yes, it's a clear example of how a dictator suppresses the free press, broadcasts lies, and the dangerous role that Fox News is playing in being exploited by Putin. So this is going to be an important moment to watch how social media reacts and how the social media companies sort out the news of the war. A positive note is that Facebook is banning Putin authored propaganda. A second major example, of course, is the coronavirus epidemic. Major papers like the New York Times, in my opinion, actually did an excellent job of explaining the virus and the epidemiology and promoting public health. There was a great innovative use of digital interactive maps and graphs, and you really see here the value of getting away from paper and using multimedia to tell stories and convey information. The techniques of news gathering have greatly improved with today's digital data tools. And these also are the kinds of things that we teach at the Graduate School of Journalism, the J School. And you could also see how digital distribution has made the Times much more of a national newspaper, serving all US states and counties with verified science-based information and helping to some degree to make up for the lack of local papers, but not carrying local news. So, nevertheless, many people distrust the New York Times and the other mainstream media outlets and turn to social media instead. YouTube and Live at 5 and talk radio. There, COVID misinformation has proliferated, and sometimes with great media skill. I'm curious to know how many of you, in the Q&A, I'd love to know how many of you saw Plandemic, a professional quality fake documentary that got an enormous amount of attention, attacking Dr. Fauci as having actually planned the pandemic. What's interesting about the misinformation around COVID, I think, is that there is a highly measurable effect. We can really see the impact of misinformation in a way that often is not clear. We can see that death rates are higher among Fox News listeners and certain zip codes and demographics that have relied on sources of misinformation. And I think it's important here to note that even its own lawyers have said that Fox is not a news station, and that Tucker and the others are entertainers and not newscasters. So another important example is, I hope we all followed, what happened so recently with Joe Rogan, the world's most popular and well-paid podcaster, who has a bigger following than the New York Times or the CDC, and who was called out. And I think that was a very important example when you talk about what to do about it. A few hundred medical professionals played a very important role in calling out Joe Rogan for spreading fake news against vaccines. Now, he's apologized, And we will see how he behaves and what effect that has on his listeners. But the result of the amount of COVID misinformation from people like Joe Rogan, from fake documentaries like a Plandemic that went viral, the result is that the US ranks quite low on vaccine compliance. Only 64% of adults are vaccinated in the United States, compared to 91% in Portugal, 86% in South Korea, 77% in France, 71% in the UK. This is all according to US News and World Report. And again, we're at 64%. And that is because of vaccine resistance that was fed by frightening misinformation. So, how did we get into this state? I think probably, we all know that it was the internet that broke the business model of journalism. I've been saying a lot of things that are positive about the new era of digital journalism in terms of distribution, in terms of the ability to gather news and convey news better than ever. But the business model was destroyed by the internet. Most people know that when Craig Newmark's Craigslist took classified advertising away from newspapers, and but even much more so, Google took ad began to follow search on Google rather than people looking to their newspapers and finding ads there. Quality journalism obviously costs money for foreign bureaus, for time, for editors, fact checkers, and investigative reporting. So the broken business model, which has left just carcasses of newspapers and magazines around the country, is now people are trying to resort to subscription models. And, indeed, the New York Times has been fairly successful with getting people to subscribe. But that is not really a great solution. It has tremendous weaknesses. And I know that because Mother Jones was a reader-based subscription model nonprofit. And as I see so many people trying to use that model to start up new places, I am too aware of the weaknesses in it. And they have to do with how hard it is to ever really raise enough money from subscriptions and donations. But even more, I think in terms of this misinformation problem, what we're creating now is an environment in which quality information is behind paywalls, but poor quality information is free. So this is not what is going to be healthy for a democracy. And free information increasingly depends on sensationalism. And certainly we see that with the incredible rise of Joe Rogan, for one example. I mean, he has such a huge following because he arouses people's emotions and he parlays conspiracy theories. So conspiracy theories tend to be arousing and interesting to people and offer them, perhaps a sense of being smart or having solutions to things that are confusing. And so it's hard to compete with conspiracy theories. And then, of course, we also have the problem of the way that the algorithms work on social media, where content that arouses strong emotions, like anger, disgust, hatred, tend to get more clicks and get more response. So we have a media environment now that really fosters the worst in us as humans. So, yeah. So institutions are slowly trying to analyze and catch up with these problems. At UC Berkeley, where I teach, obviously it's the problem has caught people's attention far beyond the journalism school, which is a very small school. We only have 100 students We have it's a 2-year program, so we admit 50 to 60 students every year, and then we have a total of about 100 to 110. So we're very small, but there are big departments at Berkeley that are paying a lot more attention to this problem as well. And the J School has fostered interdisciplinary conversations between public policy, the law school, journalism, and information technology on what to do about it. So we now have teams that are looking at proposed legislation to determine what kind of regulations we as a university should support. And the other thing that I think people are talking about a lot is, that we've been talking so far today about the supply side, the provision of bad information, but people are talking a lot more about what about the demand side? That is the hunger that people seem to have for, well, I don't know if I should really call it hunger for bad information, but the lack of distinctions that people too often make. So, for example, 40% of seniors now get their news online, and of course, far larger percentages of younger people, in fact, close to 90% of young people. So, and they're increasingly subject to misinformation. The Poynter Institute, the Media Institute, has initiated media literacy training that teaches people how to fact check like a journalist. They started with teens and college students. Now they're focusing on first-time voters and seniors. You can take their training and learn more about how to be a discriminating news consumer. And also, I think it's very valuable information to disseminate if you're in conversations with people who you think are subject to misinformation. This can be a kind of an interesting way to get a conversation going with them. And the AARP is also supporting media literacy projects for seniors. I will say that these programs, the Poynter program is supported by Facebook. Facebook, Apple, and Google are all starting to show some social responsibility in the face of criticism and pending regulations. Those regulations are particularly strong in Europe, not in this country. But they all know that regulation may be coming, and to get ahead of that, they are supporting fledgling attempts to support fact-based journalism. So we'll see how far that goes. So just in conclusion, I've laid out a lot of agonizing problems that I worry about, and I hope that you'll worry too. So what can be done? I think, first of all, I would say subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. For right now, we have a subscription-based model, not an advertising-based model to rely on. So subscribe to, don't worry about whether you don't have time to read everything you subscribe to. Think of it as a social cause and subscribe to a lot of worthy outlets that you respect, and give gift subscriptions. It has to become something that is, to some degree, viewed as a charitable endeavor. Subscribe to NPR, KQED, or whatever your local public radio stations are as well. They are sound sources for the most part. And support organizations that are trying to save journalism, like the Graduate School of Journalism, where I teach. Believe me, we're not supported by the state or the university, a very minor amount, 11%, or other journalism schools in high schools, colleges, or graduate schools. But support the training of journalists to do good work. Support nonprofit organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists, which fights for the rights of those imprisoned journalists around the world and battles big lies like the ones that Putin is telling, or like the ones that have led to so much COVID misinformation. And finally, as I mentioned before, train yourself in media literacy. It's even if you already think you're a smart, well-informed reader, or that you only trust good sources, to be more aware of how you make decisions about what to trust, so that you can talk about that with other people and so that you can combat conspiracy theories when you find them, or people who have been infected with the misinformation, I think is a very good intellectual tool that we should all have. So again, as I said, Poynter Institute and the AARP are both providing programs that do that. So those are a few ideas about what individuals can do to try to combat this problem. This is a problem that I view as second only to global warming, as a threat to our future on this planet. So I hope I haven't depressed people too much, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. I think what we'll do is, George, if you're on there, we'll start with the people who are watching the call on Zoom. If there's any question from anybody on Zoom.
And I will ask a question of the audience too, that might help get conversation started. I'm curious to know how many of you would say that you believe you do live in a filter bubble and that you are not aware of the proliferation of misinformation on social media. That would be really interesting to hear people just talk about their personal relationship to this problem. And also, I'm very curious to know whether you find that you need to combat misinformation in conversations with other people, in your family or in your community. I mean, to what extent is this a living problem for the people in this Oakmont group, I guess?
Okay, anybody on the Zoom call that wants to make a comment? I think Judy wanted to. You want to unmute yourself and make a comment, Judy?
Yeah, you talked about you teach how to tell disinformation. If we wanted to do that here, how long, is that an hour course? Is it a whole semester course? How long does it take to teach that?
Well, more than an hour and less than a whole semester, I would say. Obviously, it depends on the degree to which you do it. I mean, I don't think you would want to be teaching open source reporting, being an internet sleuth to figure out whether a video has been, has been monkeyed with. But teaching basic media literacy, I think, using the guides at the Poynter Center or AARP, I think an hour session would be a good introduction.
I'm going to make one quick comment in answer to your question, Deirdre, and then I'm going to turn it over to Barry, and then we'll go to any questions coming in the auditorium. I live in a bubble, but it isn't a bubble where I'm not aware of misinformation. It's a bubble where I avoid personally knowing what that misinformation is. So for example, I don't watch Fox News. Okay, if I watch Fox News, I would have a different sense of what's going on. But that'd be an example for me. And Oakmont is an extraordinarily homogeneous population. There are some people who would be subject to misinformation much more than the average person, but by far we're all in the same bubble. Barry, you wanted to make a comment?
With the newspapers being reduced in size and less newspapers available, isn't that just sort of a side effect of technology with social media and computers and internet? And aren't there, sort of the second part of that, aren't there lots of sites on the internet that are, quote, reliable, not Fox-like, that you can get good, reliable information from?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, the decline of newspapers is definitely a side effect of the rise of the internet, and but not just because there are more sources of information, but because of the destruction of the business model that journalism used to rely on, which was advertising. So the money just isn't there anymore. But the money has not flowed to these social media sites publications very much either. It's really mainly gone to Google. That's where the advertising money has gone. So the entire news scene is impoverished. And the people who are making a lot of money, look at Joe Rogan. So Joe Rogan has a bigger following than the New York Times. The New York Times is a very expensive operation to run, obviously. You know, the amount of, first because it still puts out a paper product, but mainly because of the labor costs, investigative reporting, foreign bureaus, and so on. Joe Rogan, a one-man show who basically doesn't do any research and doesn't fact check what he and brings on people who put forth wild conspiracy theories, is a one-man operation. So there's an incredible contrast there. That's really problematic.
Virginia, do you have a question in the audience?
Yeah, question here. I'm quite aware of misinformation, and this question might be as a result of misinformation. But an article I've recently read pointed out that in certain cases, and what percentage I don't know, certain cases the buyout of newspapers by corporate interests of one type or another have actually saved those newspapers from going out of business completely. Do you believe this is a true statement? Are you do you think this has been happening, or?
In general, the large corporations that have bought out newspapers, even where they've saved them from going out of business completely, and I think that has happened, they've done it at the cost of laying off newsroom staff, closing down on a lot of news gathering, and using more auto-generated, even AI-generated content. So there's still this vast degradation. I mean, there are 25% fewer journalism jobs than there were 15 years ago. So I think that speaks for itself, that there are just fewer working journalists producing news, and there's more repetition and reliance on large corporate sources.
Sandra, you had a question.
Yes, I wondered if you recommend that one expose oneself to sources of misinformation for the sake of awareness.
Actually, I do. I think that in a sense, that's part of media literacy, is to, look at Fox News and understand some of the arguments that they're making, but then, prepare yourself to do some fact checking and understand why that's incorrect, or be able to make the arguments. A lot of this, of course, does pertain to whether you're in a world where you're having conversations with people who rely on Fox or Sinclair or radio, which is very similar, and whether you want to engage with discussions with people who are getting their perspective from that. But I actually also think that even if you are not having those conversations, that it's part of being a well-informed citizen is to understand why the polarization in this country is happening. I was watching Tucker and Hannity after the invasion of Ukraine, just absolutely bashing Biden, and with complete disregard for the problem of global warming, demanding, and as if they could demand anything, but maybe if Trump comes back into office, they can, but that the United States should respond to this crisis by immediately starting to drilling in Antarctica, drilling shale all over America, more fracking, open up the Keystone Pipeline, making America produce a lot more oil and gas. And in order to lessen the world's dependence on Russian oil and gas. Well, the dependence on Russian oil and gas is a huge problem. It's especially a problem for Europe. But I would argue with Bill McKibben that, and in contrast to what's being said on Fox News, that this is a time when the United States should be making a major investment in alternative energy, green hydrogen for Europe, wind and solar around the world, and mobilizing, yes, the way that we did in World War II to vastly increase production, which we did in World War II, to increase armament production. But this is a time to make an incredibly strong commitment to alternative energy. And so when you hear Hannity and Tucker on Fox News ranting and railing about how terrible it is that Europe and the United States are dependent on Russia, they're right about that. And you can understand why the readers would the viewers would agree. And then they dismiss the problem of global warming completely. They bash the Green New Deal as just some kind of crazy fantasy. They bash AOC, they bash John Kerry, they bash Biden because of their commitment to the problem of global warming. So I do think that if you watch Fox News and you're prepared to intellectually combat it because you're well informed, you also are more energized, I think, to care and to want to make a difference and to want to fight for the changes that we really so desperately need. So yes, I think you should watch Fox News occasionally.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Is there another question from the auditorium?
Deidre, wonderful, wonderful talk. Very, very inspiring. I had one question for you, another dimension of the problem and maybe the fight to fix it. And that is the lack of teaching critical thinking in schools. It comes with the reaction to the critical race theory and all that. I mean, those crazy things that are happening. That seems to be another arm of the army of idiots that are trying to keep good thinking away from the United States. I wonder, is there any way that journalism schools can, focus on children and schools to increase that ability to think and argue rationally?
Yeah, good one.
Yeah, journalism schools are pretty weak, and just as the media in general is pretty weak. And so, I don't think we have the staff or the funding to try to do what we really should be doing, and to expanding the teaching of critical thinking, as you're saying, or media literacy, fact checking, understanding, how to respond to misinformation, how to identify and respond to misinformation. We actually have those skills and abilities. We really would know how to do it, but we're not funded to do it. I do think that the Pointer Institute has been trying to do that with young people. And I think that what you're pointing to is an enormous problem, the decline of education, of public education in this country. And it's essential. I mean, basically, we need a well-educated electorate and a free press. Those are the two major pillars of democracy. And we're seeing declines in both.
We had a question from Carrie and one from Suki. I'd like them both to ask their question before you answer the combination, Deidre. So Carrie, you want to ask your question?
Okay, and thank you. Yeah, I really kind of view that many local people trust and support the Santa Rosa Press Democrat. And I was wondering if you would be able to rate the strength of this particular regional newspaper.
And before we do that, I'd like Suki to ask her question.
Okay, and my question is, can you comment on how you see the Los Angeles Times changing in the last several years since ownership has changed?
Okay, you got him, Deidre.
Okay, well, I think that I'm so sorry, but I really don't feel competent to evaluate the Santa Rosa Press Democrat. I don't read it, and I haven't seen an evaluation of it. I'd be interested in what you think. The LA Times, I think the LA Times is struggling, and it is one of the things that it's part of definitely is this sort of a new movement to diversify the newsrooms. The new editor-in-chief is Black. And so I think that there's been a general movement across the media to recognize the problem of having major, almost all white newsrooms. When I entered journalism, they were white males, overwhelmingly. But now there's a strong pipeline of women going into journalism. That's got some problems too, because that's a lot of women going into a low-paid field with a lot of turnover in it and a lot of problems as a profession. But we still haven't seen the diversification of the newsrooms, and many people feel that, and I agree, that because of the lack of racial and ethnic diversity, journalism has missed a lot of stories, and hasn't been reporting on communities of color, which, as you all know, demographically are becoming extremely significant in the state of California. And so, you can't really be covered, So I think the LA Times is doing a good job of, and particularly in that way, I think they're trying to be much more accountable to the rising state demographics.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question. If you make a big emphasis, Deirdre, on fact-based journalism,
yeah,
but that's in opposition to emotion-based journalism in the misinformation area. I want to take two examples and run them side by side for you. Okay, up here we get a fair amount of emotional journalism on the homeless problem. Okay, the problem with that is there's a large number of people for whom homeless represents something they don't want to have to deal with. So therefore, the more you emphasize it, the more they are against what you're saying. On the other hand, relative to the COVID crisis, there were far more incidents reported about the boy who got the problem because he got the vaccine, as opposed to the child who was a problem because his pregnant mother, and I'm talking about reporting the human being, not reporting the math of it, but reporting on the human being we're talking about. Do you also teach emotion-based journalism that's what I would call more fact-based?
It's a really interesting question. And I think I get what you're driving at. So let me just say that, yes, to tell the story, journalism is storytelling, right? And facts only take you so far. If you're going to have reader interest, you've got to put those facts often into a feature story or a news story with an interesting lead that, probably starts with an anecdote or an individual and tells their story, and uses that as a way to kind of sugarcoat, the facts that you're trying to convey. So of course we're teaching that all the time. But it's got an inherent problem, which is that anecdotes are not the best way to evaluate systemic problems. So this is the problem of false equivalency. If you have one doctor who says beware of vaccines, and then you counter that by quoting another doctor who says vaccines are essentially safe, that they save more lives than there are difficulties with them. It seems as though you have one authority versus another authority, but actually the ratio is more like 1 to 99. In other words, 99% of doctors would favor the public health prescriptions to have vaccines against one who would raise doubts. So, but you can't quote 99 experts in a news piece in favor and then one who isn't. So this problem of the manipulation of emotions, by who you quote, or trying to avoid false equivalency, or finding ways to convey statistical information. These are all things that, yes, we talk about and we teach. I agree with you that emotions are what really drive people much more than facts. And so you have to find ways to impart facts that also do speak to people's emotions.
But I'm thinking about Press Democrat at one point in the last year had the headline about the boy who got the heart problem because he got the vaccine.
Yeah.
Okay, single headline across the top of the page. Okay,
Yeah.
headline and story about a single human being. Okay, I don't remember any headline, and I think the Press Democrat's a pretty good paper, but I don't remember any headline that said, let me tell you about the mother who had the problem with her baby because she got COVID and ended up in the OR. Name, rank, serial number, pictures, the whole bit. Okay,
Yeah.
so the people who respond to emotion have no way of getting their hands around false equivalency. Okay, I'm going to stop asking. Marie, you had a question before we all start.
To emotion. We all respond to emotion. So I think that what you're saying is really right, that, you know, the media have to be aware of countering stories like the story of a young man who gets a heart problem with stories about people who died of COVID.
Marie, you had a question at the very beginning, and we're now at the end. You want to ask your question?
Oh, okay. My question was about CNN. A lot of people get their news through TV, and CNN has just changed CEOs. And I did hear something that the new CEO wants the programming to be more real news-based as opposed to talking heads. And I wondered if you had any comment on that.
Well, I think that's a really positive development. I mean, Jeff Zucker, who left CNN under a cloud, is the one who said, I talked about how Trump was so good for CNN. He said, Trump may not be good for the nation, but he's very good for CNN. So I think that CNN is ripe for a shakeup, and I wasn't a big fan of Jeff Zucker, so I hope I'll be a fan of the new guy.
Jeff, you had a question.
Can you hear me
Yes.
outside? Yeah, I've been a school teacher, and I actually worked at the Press Democrat a number of years in a variety of ways. That one of the things that really scares me is hearing the word breaking, or two words, breaking news. And on CNN and MSNBC, both of groups I trust fairly well. But if you scream breaking news about everything, and they come very close to that, and I think it does a great deal of distorting, you know, what's more significant. And it's much harder to judge if all you're listening to is breaking news, more breaking news, and more breaking news.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And I think that, you know, we've seen an incredible speed up of the news cycle, and now it's sort of 24/7. And it fosters a sense of anxiety and
Yeah, everything is eek.
Sorry, everything is equal?
Eek.
Everything is eek. Yeah.
E-E-K.
Yeah, yeah. And then, you know, people just turn off completely. Many people just want to turn away from news completely. Yeah, I think it's important to read magazines and features that put things into perspective.
Okay, there's a question in the auditorium from Jeff. Jeff, you want to tackle yours?
Hello, this is Martin Johns. So Jeff's right behind me. I had a couple of maybe more practical questions. We have this problem of if you want to read the New York Times, you need to subscribe $100 or whatever it is. The internet gives you the opportunity to access lots of sources. Once I've paid my $100, I'll feel obligated to access the New York Times, period. And I really like to use the ability of the internet to access lots of things. So is there a practical reason why we cannot pay per view or pay for the amount of time we spend on any particular source? either by direct monitoring or by some third party, which would be an intermediary?
Yes, that's a great question. So there are some efforts on the part of the big tech companies to respond to that demand, and they're really pretty new and controversial. So you can pick up your iPhone and read Apple News. It comes with your phone. Google News also. Google's been supporting. Has been, supporting different, a variety of different outlets. So you could be reading Google News. There's actually, though, it hasn't been going incredibly well for the publications. And the Washington Post, for example, just withdrew from their contract with Google News because they didn't think they were getting a fair cut of the revenue. And so all this is still being worked out. But yes, I think it is good to have aggregators that you trust. That and there are some, and by the way, there are some a number of outlets now. Like one of them is called the Flip Side, which will try to show you arguments from the right, left, and center. We're kind of organized that way. I think that is something that the tech companies are trying to monetize, is ways to get the consumer's dollar to be spent per article. So basically disaggregating them from the original publication. And I think that will be increasingly it'll be increasingly possible to do that.
Deirdre, that leads right
Can I-
into Peggy Hinkle's question. I'd like to jump to Peggy if I could. Peggy?
Hello. I think you just answered a lot of it. My question was, what websites do you recommend that are not Fox-like? And you could have said Apple, Google, and Flipside. Did you mention Sinclair earlier?
Sinclair is a terrible source. They're similar to Fox News. They're a radio.
Okay.
They're
I didn't know.
They have bought up a lot of radio stations across the country, or talk radio stations, and they're the kind of thing that truckers are listening to, and they Rush Limbaugh and Alex Jones and all kinds of fake news on their stations, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Martin, I cut you short. Do you have a continuation?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned Google News, because it leads to my second question. Google News, one, they sort of act as a filter. They like to feed you what they know you're interested in.
Yes.
And two, they also feed you to articles, for example, the Wall Street Journal, which you cannot access except by subscribing to the Wall Street Journal. So my second question was about registering for these sources, and the BBC now keeps asking me to register, and I don't think they want to use it to charge, but I think they want to use it to start sending me what they think I want to hear, and that concerns me, so I don't register. Is that a correct interpretation of registering?
Well, it depends on their privacy policy of the individual outlet, which you can look for and try to read all the boilerplate. So they could be different for each one. Yes, I think the BBC wants you to register. Probably you can affect what they will send you by what boxes you check. They're going to offer you different newsletters or different, things that they want to send you in your email, and you can decline that. I mean, I think that's a pretty safe place to register, but I do agree that when you register for various news sites, you're also often, setting yourself up to then get more information from them than you necessarily want.
Okay, I've got Jeff backed up in the auditorium, Judith, who wants to ask a question about Berkeley side, and Barry, who's got his hand up. Jeff, you're the longest on. You want to ask your question?
Thank you. And I think there's at least one more question in the auditorium if we have time. My question, so legitimate journalists, I'll use that air quoted, have been much better about calling out the garbage. but how can they be even more forceful? I'll give as an example, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the senator in Louisiana, who has been deliberately spreading a lot of misinformation about COVID. Why isn't he running into a firestorm of people willing to call him out for what he's doing?
Well, he has encountered criticism. I think one thing that's been very effective is that a number of his cousins have come together, other members of the Kennedy family have come together and made a statement recently, basically saying, we love our relative, but he's completely crazy on this, and this is a conspiracy theory, and we denounce his anti-vaccine propaganda. So, speaking out is so important. And of course, it needs to be the right person speaking out in each case. Members of the Kennedy family was perfect for that one. The doctors, the consortium of doctors, and I don't think it was a huge number, but it was doctors and public health officials. I think it was only about 200 who complained about Joe Rogan, and it had an impact. So sometimes, the media needs to be able to report on legitimate individuals who are newsworthy because they are opposing some kind of misinformation in the news. At the same time, the media can have investigative reports on misinformation. And I think that did happen with the Plandemic documentary that became so viral. And I think the media, investigated Plandemic and came back with the verdict that it was all false. But anyway, the media is in a kind of a relationship with legitimate authorities or people who have some interesting dispute to report.
Okay, we have a question from Judith Justice, and then we'll throw it back to the auditorium. Judith?
My question was about if you could comment on efforts such as Berkeley Side that are trying to encourage local reporting and also working with other communities to start similar local newspapers. And I think related to that, I went to a talk once where NPR talked about efforts they have to fund communities that are less well funded than the Bay Area to have local news reporting. If you've been involved with it.
Thank you. I really love Berkeley Side. The editor-in-chief and one of the co-founders is a graduate of our school, the J School. They now have started a sister publication called Oakland Side, and that is also, the editor-in-chief there is also a graduate of our program. So we really believe in local journalism and local nonprofit journalism, and these are great models. And they are popping up around the country, and there are, some efforts to promote these community-based local journalism. I did say earlier that I also see the weakness of that model, largely because of my experience at Mother Jones, which was run on that model, nonprofit, subscriber and donor-based journalism. And it's tough. It's just tough to raise that much money from the community. That's why I encourage you, again, all of you, to open up your wallets and subscribe, and support nonprofit community-based journalism.
Okay, back to the auditorium.
I have a question. Thank you, Deirdre, for this fabulous presentation. I wanted to ask you about what you thought about the yellow journalism period under, William Randolph Hearst in terms of, was that as profound an impact as what we're going through now? And my second question is, if you could name 3 that you would suggest subscribing to, like I subscribe to the Christian Science Monitor, which I find informative and uplifting. If you've mentioned the New York Times, are there 2 or 3 others that you would like to recommend?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's not the first time that journalism has, been in bad shape. And, the Graduate School of Journalism is on Hearst Avenue. And I always like to tell people, to remind people who don't usually know, that it wasn't named after William Randolph Hearst. It was named after Phoebe Hearst, his mother, who funded the construction of a lot of the Berkeley campus. So anyway, no, he wasn't a great hero. But in terms of places to subscribe to, there are a lot of great places that these are exactly the places that I think need support. The Guardian US, I think is a great site that I recommend. I think that NPR, actually, they really have a wonderful print resources. Don't just listen to them on the radio, but look at their website. The New York Times and the Washington Post or the LA Times, I think, are all reputable mainstream places. I think the Atlantic has been doing a great job. I think it's been the best magazine on the coronavirus. I'll put in a plug for Mother Jones. Mother Jones magazine, I'm no longer affiliated with it, but it's run by two women who I think have done a great job, and it's got more followers and readers than ever before. So I think for a really fact-based, alternative, left, feminist, anti-racist perspective, Mother Jones is a really good source.
Okay, we're getting near the end, although we've still got questions coming in, Deirdre. Barry, you had a question.
I just was wondering that, to me, what gets reported in the news is usually negative. It's an accident, it's a war, it's a crime, it's a whatever.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of uplifting news, and I can understand why, but I'm curious about why there isn't more uplifting news reported. At least like a little plug at the end, the half-hour news article or something in the paper that's a more uplifting story. Because a lot of people just don't read the news because they find it depressing, even though it's all factual.
Right. Well, the world is filled with problems and people need to be well informed, but I do understand, the gloom that can come from reading the paper. I think there's a really good effort which is called solutions journalism, and you can Google that. They have an interesting website. It's not exactly what you're saying because it's not like happy news, but it's their complaint. These are a bunch of top professional journalists. Their complaint has been basically that the news media are always saying what the problems are, but never saying what the solutions are. And why can't the news media focus more on where people are solving problems, where people are doing good things? And I think that's a really valid criticism. And so solutions journalism is having an impact, I think, across the country on the media. And people are beginning to look a little bit more for some positive stories, things that work. Places that have, made progress on the homeless problem, for example. I mean, every place isn't the same, and some places have done better than others on the opioid crisis or the homeless crisis. So what can we learn from solutions in other places? I think that's really helpful. There's a site called Reasons to be Cheerful, which tries to report on good news. So you might want to look at that. But I know what you mean. A heavy news diet can make you a little pessimistic.
Okay, I have one more question at this end. Are there any more in the auditorium? Okay, if not, Tom Cook, you had a question.
Yes, George. Yes, we have some here in the auditorium.
Oh, okay, auditorium next then.
You have to unmute. Okay.
I'm getting the microphone over there.
I wrote it in.
He just said, Tom Cook, you haven't.
Tom's next.
Yeah, George, I'm wondering if the speaker is concerned about fake news from left-leaning sources. Most of our attention this morning is focused on fake news from the right wing.
Yes, I am very much so. One of the things that I feel when I was the editor of Mother Jones magazine, we established a fact-checking department there that was stronger than the one at the New Yorker. So, I think that the important thing is establishing facts. Then people can have different opinions about those facts. But so I think that there are more or less reputable outlets on the left, and there are left outlets that are ungrounded and erroneous in their basic facts, or who just have wild opinions. So, I've seen a little bit of that around the Ukraine thing, um, coming from the far left, even backing Putin. So it's, of course, that's very troubling. It seems to be a pretty small problem compared to the problem of the right at the moment. I mean, I don't know why, but the right seems to be better at promoting crazy conspiracy theories than the far left.
Okay, trying to get this thing to a close. We have one more in the auditorium, and I've got one more here on the Zoom.
Okay, hi, I'm Ed Biglin. I wanted to ask you to comment on a recent tendency by wealthy people to sponsor lawsuits against news outlets. I'm thinking of Balea versus Gawker or Palin versus the New York Times, which are different substantively, but the same thing. And I also have an unrelated question, which my own background in journalism tells you never to do. But the only place I've seen some historical context on the current Ukraine situation is an article, an op-ed in the New York Times by Tom Friedman. And I'll say this carefully, I don't think the Ukraine war is justified. Putin's arguments are amazing. That's all you can say. But when he asks that NATO not expand into Ukraine, he's effectively asking the West to keep a promise that was made when the Soviet Union broke up and Russia agreed to help dismantle the Ukrainian nuclear weapons. And in return, both Reagan and George Bush the first and Clinton promised that we would not expand NATO into the former Soviet republics, which then George W. Bush ignored. And so, in spite of Putin being a thug, sometimes even thugs have reasonable positions on certain things.
I really agree that that's an important thing to be discussing, and that that our country encouraged Ukraine to take the position it did, and then we're not really there for them when they're invaded. I mean, the invasion right now is so stark that it's hard to have two minds about that. But in terms of the history of how we got there, I think there's a lot of room for criticism of this country.
Okay, I'm going to let Robin take.
That should be a subject for another whole seminar.
I'm going to let Robin take the last question, which a lot of us have anyway. Robin, you're on.
Okay. Am I muted or can you hear me?
You're good.
Hear you.
Okay. All right. So my question is, how do we talk to people who feed on misinformation and are convinced that their perspective is the truth and they don't want to hear any other perspective? I mean, I have people that I try to talk to and they say, and I'm telling them what I think are facts, and they say, that's just stupid, and I feel like you just can't get through to some people because they have their set of facts and I have my set of facts, and never the twain shall meet, even though you want to meet somewhere.
Well, I think you would really get a lot since you are having those kinds of conversations. You would get a lot out of looking at the Pointer Center training or the AARP training, because it really is oriented towards helping people with that problem. But I think that since we have so little time left, I'm just going to say very simply that interrogating people gently about where did you get that fact? What is that? Where did you learn that? What's the basis of that? Who said that? Can you give me your source? Can be helpful. And of course, it means that you also need to be able to defend, where you learned something. and just kind of comparing notes with somebody, kind of going, well, you know, I got this information from, you know, from my source, what's your source? And then discussing, you know, the validity of these competing sources with someone. That can be a good, gentle first step.
Thank you.
Deirdre, I cannot thank you enough for having led us through this very frustrating topic, and wish you and the School of Journalism nothing but the best. A reminder to everyone that next week we will be looking at photography through a tremendously interesting lens. Thank you very much. Wrapping up for the day.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.